So we're endeavoring to try to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus. What do we have to do to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean? Well, I'm trying to keep things straightforward and concise, as difficult as that might be for something so broad and so all-consuming. But here it is in a nutshell. And this is kind of a summary of last week's message. That being a follower of Jesus is a total life commitment. We commit our entire life over to God, and we try to begin in a place of humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. If we were left to ourselves, that we would be headed toward disaster. And so we make Jesus the king of our lives. That's really what it means to be a Christian, somebody who believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. It means that we believe he's our king. He's the king of the kingdom of God. And God has placed him in that role and in that position so that one day this whole world can change. But right now, he wants us to change individually by making Jesus our king and letting his power and his spirit change us from the inside out. So again, we make Jesus the king of our lives. We completely commit our lives to Jesus. It's not too different than when we were kids, or when kids today look up to their heroes, whether it be a sports star or celebrity or whatever it was. For me, it was superheroes, and I still love DC superheroes like Batman, and I look up to them. As a kid, I looked up to Batman and Superman as being these amazing people of virtue who always did the right thing, who didn't cross those lines. And that's kind of what bothers me about some of the more modern interpretations, especially in the modern movies of these characters, is they kind of miss the point that these are people to look up to, and these are people who do the right thing, so that we can have that standard, that ideal to look toward and strive toward. But that's what Jesus is for all of us, and should be for all of us, is this ultimate ideal, the personification of God himself, of God's character in the form of a man, of the person of Jesus. And so that's what it means when we want to be a follower of Jesus. We look up to, we admire Jesus so much that we want to learn everything about him and be like him. Again, just as a kid wants to learn everything about their hero and be like them. We want to be committed students of Jesus. Really, that's what the word disciple means, a student of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, someone who learns from him, and someone who wants to be like him. So in order to be a true committed follower of Jesus, we actually have to make sure that we're not living for our desires only, but that we are living with him in mind all the time. We want to, in a sense, give up our own way and make Jesus the king of our lives. And as he said, take up our cross daily. So there's this verse when Jesus said, if anyone wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. That is, be willing to give up anything and everything if it means following Jesus, and in order to follow Jesus truly and fully. There are more verses that speak to this kind of entire commitment, this kind of life commitment that we are called to be as followers of Jesus. And this is what I want us to focus in on today, as we have named this message today, Living as Jesus Lived. There's a verse from 1 John, which is one of Jesus' disciples. John wrote this letter, and he said this: "Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did." In other words, if you are saying that you are a Christian, or if you are saying that you are a follower of Jesus, or if that's something you want to pursue, then what you need to be doing is living your life as Jesus lived his life. So the example that he gave us, we need to emulate and imitate. Jesus himself said that students are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. In other words, the goal and the purpose of a student, of disciples, is to become like their teacher. You're not better than your teacher. The whole point is that you're trying to learn from your teacher. In this case, we're trying to learn from Jesus. Jesus has the answers that we're looking for in life. He's our guide. And this is something that I tried to communicate to our young people this past week, that Jesus is our guide to life. And he is that. He is our guide by looking at his life. We need to read the Gospels. We need to read the Bible to understand what Jesus did and then try to see how that applies and works out in our lives each day. But when I think about living as Jesus lived, and in fact, in a more literal translation of that verse I quoted from 1 John, it actually says, you must walk as Jesus walked. And that word walk actually has meaning within the Jewish context that Jesus lived. It actually refers to how one lives out their religious life. It's not necessarily how Jesus did mundane things. It's how Jesus lived out his faith, how Jesus lived out his relationship to God, and how he was a part of the larger life of the people of Israel. And so that gets me thinking, and some of you who are newer might not know that I'm very interested, and I have been very interested in my life, the Jewish roots of our faith, of the Christian faith, understanding that Jesus was Jewish and lived in a thoroughly Jewish context. And in fact, he was a Jewish person living in the land of Israel, so the center of the Jewish faith right there in the land of Israel. And he would often visit the capital, he would visit Jerusalem, and he lived as what we would call a Torah observant person, somebody who was faithful to God's commandments and lived according to God's ways found in Scripture, and also according to the traditions of the Jewish people and how the Jewish people interpret those commandments. He lived accordingly, and he was a part of that lifestyle. He certainly had disagreements with the other religious teachers of the day, but he nevertheless was one of them in that sense. He was part of the larger religious community of Israel. Maybe you don't know anything about Jewish life or Judaism, but I'll give you just some examples. He kept the Sabbath. He kept all of the biblical festivals like Passover. He even kept the traditional holiday of Hanukkah. He would visit the temple in Jerusalem and worship God according to all of the rules and regulations that are laid out in the Bible. He would attend synagogue on Saturday mornings, and he would read from the Torah and the prophets and say all of the prayers that the people of Israel would pray. I can go on and on, and believe me, there's lots we could talk about as it relates to how Jesus lived out, in fact, the religious life of the people of Israel. And so there was a certain way that Jesus lived. He had a certain routine of religious life that he lived. And contrary to what some may think that Jesus was like a hippie, that Jesus was like, free love and free living and just lived however he wanted, and I don't know, wasn't very disciplined in that way. It's just not the way the Gospels and the Bible present Jesus. If you understand the Bible and the Gospels from a historical context, if you understand the historical context, then you can see that Jesus was a first century Jewish person living in the land of Israel and was, again, unique and had his opinions and was very special, but was not of a different kind in terms of his religion. He was Jewish, and he observed, in a sense, the religion of Judaism. And so that presents me, at least, with a conundrum. It's like, does that mean that then we, as most of us watching right now are probably not Jewish? I'm not Jewish. Does that mean that, we need to live a Jewish lifestyle? It would be wonderful if I could give you just a simple yes or no answer to that. There is actually nothing in the Scripture that says we shouldn't be engaging in those things and pursuing that sort of lifestyle. There are still Jewish people today. They still live according to their traditions, many of which are based upon the Bible, and many of which Jesus himself engaged in. There's absolutely nothing stopping us from pursuing those things if we believe that that is something that makes sense for us and is beneficial to us and will allow us to connect with Jesus more. I encourage that, and I think that that's something wonderful if that's what you want to do in your own home and in your own life. However, my understanding is that we should be focusing in on those aspects that have to do more so with moral living, with character building, things that are going to enable us to grow in love. Now, Jesus actually said that the most important commandment is to love God. So he's thinking of the commandments that are found in the Bible, in the Torah. And there is a commandment to love God. That is your entire self. But then he said that the second is equally important. He said to love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, no other commandment is greater than these. Again, I don't think Jesus was a hippie, so I don't think love God and love your neighbor is some vague thing. But I think that Jesus showed us and taught about what it would mean to love God and what it would mean to love your neighbor as yourself. And why would he say that loving your neighbor is equally as important as loving God? It's almost as if to say that when we love our neighbor, when we love one another, we are loving God. That's what it means to engage in loving God, is to love one another, to live out the love that we have for God through and to others. Makes sense? We are made in God's image. We are his children in that sense. And God would want us to love one another and to get along. And so Jesus taught about these things. He gives a parable, and we're not going to get into it too deeply right now, but I want to remind us of the Good Samaritan parable, this story that he said of a Jewish man who was overtaken and beaten and robbed by some criminals. And he's left there on the side of the road, and as he's laying there on the side of the road, you have a priest and a Levite come by and they ignore him. But then a Samaritan comes by, somebody who was in a sense related to the Jewish people and sort of shared the Jewish faith, but many of the elements of the Jewish faith was different. In fact, it's kind of similar to how Christianity and Judaism have diverged and became different over the years, over the centuries. But that's a whole other topic. But here's the thing. Jesus says that the Samaritan was the one who came and helped the Jewish person who was beaten and robbed and helped him get back onto his feet, both literally and figuratively. And the question Jesus asked, the question now, which one of the three that encountered this man was that person's neighbor? And the answer is the Samaritan was. The person who was, in a sense, the other, the enemy, somebody who's different, somebody with whom that person would have disagreed, actually turns out to be that person's neighbor because of the mercy and compassion that was shown. And so Jesus, I think the point of the parable, I have to dig deeper into that parable at some point and study it more deeply. But I think the point of the parable is that love and compassion can transcend differences and disagreements. I really want us to focus in on this. This is my main point for this message. If you get nothing else, if you want to live as Jesus lived, I think we can do this. And that is, regardless of who you are interacting with, regardless of what they have done to you, you have a responsibility to live a certain way towards them, to treat them with kindness and compassion. Doesn't mean you become other people's slaves. It doesn't mean you let other people walk all over you or do whatever they want to you. It doesn't mean you can't cut people out of your life who are toxic. We've talked about that in the past. You certainly can do that. Those are good and healthy things for you, for your mental health, for your growth as a person, as a follower of Jesus. But when it comes to the interactions that we are inevitably going to have with people with whom we disagree or that we find ourselves at odds with in some way, I think we have this responsibility to treat them with compassion and try to have understanding towards them, empathy towards them, to be kind towards them. That's, and it can be as simple as our interactions with people on social media, our interactions with people at the grocery store, our interactions with people, with people out in the public square, so to speak, in politics or in whatever, wherever you find yourself at work or whatever it is, where you have some strong disagreement and it becomes apparent and it becomes a problem. You then have a choice to live in a certain way towards that person that shows God's love and shows how Jesus would have handled the situation. And so, again, learning from Jesus about how we interact with one another. And even when you have overbearing, terrible tyrants over you, as the Romans were towards the Jewish people in that day. Jesus even said, and I love the way this translation puts it, I tell you not to try to get even with a person who has done something to you, that is to say, done something bad to you. Don't get even with them. You might see in your translation, it says, don't resist an evil person, or don't retaliate against an evil person. Don't try to get even with them. The rest of that verse we can get into another time, but the whole idea of if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn and let the person slap you on the other cheek. We've talked about this before. That's not Jesus saying you should become a punching bag, but it is simply saying our choice is not to get even. We have a choice, and we're going to choose not to get even with that person, and we're not going to escalate things. But in fact, our compassion and our standing firm in what is right is actually going to diffuse the situation and allow us to show God's love to that person. And so this is the balance we need to seek. And I'm sort of reiterating a point from last week here. Speaking the truth or presenting the truth to others, even if they disagree with it, is not an evil thing to do. It's not meant to hurt them. Even if it does hurt them in some way or causes them discomfort, it's not meant to do that. And we have to understand that presenting the truth is sometimes absolutely necessary. Being true to who we are in Jesus and presenting that to others, either in what we say or in what we do, or presenting it in some way. But then we take that reality and that necessity sometimes, and we say, well, we also have a responsibility as followers of Jesus to keep the peace, to be peacemakers, to be non-violent, to not escalate things, to not make things worse, right? This world is already pretty chaotic. We don't need to add to the chaos. So we need to be those who bring calmness and civility and love and compassion and kindness to others and to this world. And so living as Jesus lived, we have a call and we have a responsibility to live as Jesus lived. What does that mean? It can mean a lot of things. And I encourage you to pursue Jesus by reading the Gospels, by praying, by joining our church, by joining Bible studies that we might do, or listen to my sermons, or listen to other Bible teachings that you might find. Find out what it means to be somebody who is living as Jesus lived. But I think the best thing that we can do is express the love that we have for God by loving others. And that means showing them kindness, compassion, understanding, not escalating things, not trying to get even with others, not trying to put people in their place or anything like that. But, in a sense, bringing Jesus into the situation. What would happen if Jesus was a part of your conversation? Well, you have an opportunity to bring Jesus to the conversation by you acting as Jesus would act in that conversation, saying what Jesus would say. So I encourage you, get to know Jesus more, get to know how he lived his life and what he would say in situations. The more you do that, the more you will live as he lived and love as he loved.